We have reached the moment we have all been waiting for, the imposter. Or more exactly, how to create it. Let's find out together. I'm Adrian and welcome to Redefine Gamedev. This is the place where Gamedev starts. In today's episode we'll look into how to decide which person is the imposter, and also we will add the chat functionality so we can chat about who we might think it's the imposter. Before we start with the tutorial, if you want a shortcut to this, if you want the full project put up together by me and some extra things, be sure to check out the package I've put in the link below. It's 50% off. I estimate that around December we will have a full release, so if you want to look in that sweet deal, you should know this. If you want it for free, there are a couple of different options. The first one is to check the unlock codes. By the way, in the previous two videos I've hidden some unlock codes and nobody found them yet, so if you're interested in that, you can give it a try. If you need help with anything or you just want to discuss about game development, don't forget to join the Redefiners gang on Discord. Now let's get started with the tutorial. First comes the imposter selection. We will need a script called master client. Here we will do the most code for this task. I noticed that some objects in the hierarchy can be nicely grouped under the environment game object and proceeded to do that. This is good because it keeps the project clean. Next, we will create an empty game object that will hold the master client script. Before heading into the script, we will also tag the player prefab with the player tag. If that one is not available, don't worry, since you can create one quite easily. You might ask yourself, why is the script called master client? Well, for this you need to have a small primer on how master client works. One of the most common network architectures is client server, where the server decides something and the client receives the information and sends the player input. This structure has many advantages, such as keeping the game in sync or cheat prevention. But it has one major disadvantage. You need a dedicated server to run the game. I don't want to get into the technical details, but even if one of the players is the server, the connection might be challenging because of the network address translation. Luckily for us, we will be using another architecture. But what is it? Enter the master client. This is an architecture commonly used in Photon. Note that Photon also provides server support if needed. In this system, all that we have are the clients, with a catch. Only one of them is special. It has more decision power. And we will use this authority to pick the imposter. The first thing we need in the master client is the imposter window, which will appear at the beginning of the game with the text saying there is one or more imposters among us. Instead of initializing in the awake as usual, we want more control to who initializes the script. This is why we are implementing a custom initialize function. In here we will start a coroutine that picks the imposter. A coroutine is needed because this action might span on multiple frames, as we will see shortly. Remember the player tag? By using find game objects with tag, we query the whole scene and we get all the game objects tagged by the specific string. This function returns a list of the game objects. Before proceeding, let's do a small primer on async operations. This will come in handy when coding for multiplayer games. Usually, in your typical single-player game, actions are nicely sequenced, so when you wait for something, you know when you're gonna receive it. This is nice because it simplifies a lot of our work. In multiplayer, things don't look the same. For example, player B does a specific action and, after a second, player A listens for it. You get a mismatch which might never get solved because player A will wait indefinitely. We can solve this by checking multiple times with delays or other solutions. In this specific case, we will query the players as they initialize in the scene, which might not happen at the same time for everyone. The player's length are how many objects tagged player are in the scene and how many we actually expect. While doing this video, I realized I made a mistake since the player list will give all the players on the server, even people joining other rooms. We don't want that. To fix this, we need to check the current room for the player. The text is on the screen. You have also probably noticed that I'm using a do-while loop instead of a while. Why is that? Let's quickly answer it. Even though they look similar and behave similar, there is one difference between while and do-while loops. Can you spot it from here? Let's look how a do-while would be written with a simple while. You see there are two executes. This is because the condition in while is checked before the execution and in do-while after. This means that regardless of the condition being good or bad, the do-while still executes once. To simulate this with a normal while, we need to have two executions, one before while and one after. And in our case, the instruction is a couple of lines and I don't like repeating code, so I opted for a cleaner solution. If you don't like it, you can use this trick to change it to a normal while. Be careful when implementing while loops in multiplayer. It might be, for example, that the player list of a specific size, but the player dropped for some reason. In this case, the while loop might never finish. To prevent this, we will implement a tries system, basically a value that increments with each try, and we will set it to 5 tries. This will prevent infinite loops. Also, instead of checking every frame, let's wait a little longer. This is good because find game objects with tag is an operation that takes a lot of processing power. Now that we have the player list, let's see how we can pick our imposters. In the player index, we will keep each player's number to be careful not to pick them twice if there are 2 imposters or more. First, let's initialize the player index list. This is very easy because we need to iterate the list and just keep the index 0, 1, 2, etc. Next, we will decide how many imposters we want in our game. You can customize this as you like, even 50-50 players and imposters. By the way, this if can be simplified using a ternary operator. Since this is a simple if by design, we can use this line which does the same. Checks if the players are less than 5, if so then it will be 1 imposter, if not there will be 2. Be careful with this though, because it doesn't fit all the cases. Let's proceed to assigning the imposter. Here is where we will pick randomly a player index from the list we just created. Don't forget to take out the picked index, otherwise you might assign the same person twice as the imposter. Lastly, we will call a remote procedure call. By the way, I discuss more about remote procedure calls in this video popping up right now. That will set the imposter on the client side. Don't forget to decrease the imposter number, otherwise it will be an infinite loop as well. To initialize the master client, we will use the network script. Here we will get reference to the master client. Next, we will check if the current player is the master client using Photon and only run the initialize function if it is. As for setting up the imposter on each client, we will use the killable script. Let's just use a debug log for testing. We will also need to highlight Photon that this is an RPC. In the scene, we need to assign the references for all the objects. Let's run it. And it works, since we are the only ones in the scene. Now that you know who the imposter is, we should not provide the kill lines to the other players which are not imposters. This is done in the killable script. If we have a target and we are not the imposter, then we should not show the line. Also, the kill button can be disabled for the regular players. This is done in the UI control script. We need to actually set the killable to be an imposter or not. To test this in the UI control first. And now we can update the button's visibility in the update loop. Let's test it. We will need to do a little hack to set 0 imposters before running the game. And the button is gone. Don't forget to put back the values after testing. We have decided who the imposter is and how many they are. It's good to let everyone know the number. For this, we will create a new window with the text saying exactly this. The master client script will handle the Windows display and text. It will receive an RPC when the final decision was made. To show the impostor window for a defined time, we will use a coroutine and set it up nicely to display the text as well. The text is a little tricky since we might need to say is or are depending on the number of impostors. Lastly, after the specified seconds, we will hide back the window. Now, to call this show imposter animation, we need to trigger the RPC. This function will be called on all clients, including the master client. One thing to note here, since the imposter number has been manipulated, we can make a copy out of it to use it correctly in our RPC. Also, the master client needs a photon view to work. The imposter task is finished. Let's move on to the chat functionality now. I'll fast forward the UI creation and slow down when it gets interesting. The most complex part about the UI is how to have a dynamic list that can render new elements on the go. To achieve this, we will use some Unity UI components. The first one is scroll rect. This component allows us to move an element, like a list, with drag motion. We need to create a container to reference it. This will have all our chat messages inside. Now, for each chat message, we'll create an image serving as the background with a horizontal layout. The image will contain a small image with the player's color and the text of our message. To display each message aligned correctly, we will attach our container a vertical layout group. There are still some tweaks needed, but after a couple of them, it starts to look better. To mask the chat only to the window, we will apply the mask component on the chat container. Also, since the size of the chat container gets bigger with each message, we will need to adjust it automatically. Unity provides yet another useful component in form of content size fitter. Lastly, we will set the correct pivot for the whole list, so that when we add new elements, they will align at the bottom of the list. Let's create a prefab out of the chat item since we will instantiate it via the code. For the chat, we will need two scripts, one for the chat item and one for the chat window. Let's add the scripts to their game objects. Starting with the chat item UI, we will need a reference to the text and image inside of it, and a way to initialize them with text and color. We need to set up them in the prefab before moving on. The chat will be done in a couple of steps. Firstly, we will make sure that we can instantiate new messages. Then we will use the input text, and lastly, we will sync them over with RPCs. An important thing to note here is that we need to properly parent the chat item, give it the position 0 and scale 1 to make sure that the layout will handle it properly. After this, we can move to the local chat functionality. We will nicely wrap up the instantiation of a chat item within the instantiate function. There are two ways to send a message, either pressing the enter key or send the text button UI. We can create a function that will be called by them to take the input from the text and put it in the chat. It's always good to check for empty messages to prevent sending them. Let's test it. And it works. Also, when we finish sending the message, it's nice to clear the input field to start fresh. For the multiplayer chat, there are not so many things to add. Of course, you need to extend the photo and mono behavior in order to have the network functionality. Next is to create an RPC that will be called on all the clients receiving the text and the color split up in red, green and blue. This is where we'll also call instantiate chat item. In send message, we will make a call to the RPC on all the clients, including this one. To get the player color, we need to query the player info. In this script, we will also need to expose the color by using the current color. To initialize the player info to the chat window UI, we will use the network script. This is because we don't have a reference to the player until it's not spawned in the scene. We need to make some adjustments to the old code of assigning the camera. And of course to assign the player info after. Note that the player info might be null, so it's good to check before send. Now it's testing time. It would be good also to add a chat button that enables or disables the chat window. We can use the UI control for this and rig a new on button event that will be set to activate or deactivate the window. Now, for some fixes. Stopping the player move if the chat window is open, for example. Another fix is to keep the chat input highlighted when both enabling the window as well as sending the message. And now for the final test, the multiplayer. So this is it for today. Don't forget, if you want to be where the game dev begins, subscribe and hit the notification bell. I'm Adrian and I'm signing out.